May 27, 1942. The basement of the old administration building, Pearl Harbor. Hawaii Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer stared at the 5-digit number groups covering his desk, his eyes burning from another marathon shift in the windowless dungeon that housed Station Hypo. The Benzedrina tablets kept him awake, but they couldn't stop the weight of responsibility pressing down on every decision. The pencil in his hand trembled slightly as he made another notation on the worksheet before him. Beside him, stacks of IBM punch cards towered like monuments to months of painstaking work. Each card represented hours of analysis, countless cross-references, and the accumulated knowledge of a team pushed beyond normal human limits. Everything depended on what these numbers meant. Everything, the war, the Pacific Fleet, thousands of American lives hanging in the balance. He reached for another punch card from the stack beside him, comparing code groups against the patterns his team had painstakingly assembled over 6 months of brutal work. In a war room 3 floors above, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for an answer that would determine whether he gambled his last 3 aircraft carriers against a Japanese armada that outnumbered him in every category of ship. The stakes couldn't be higher. After Pearl Harbor, after months of defeats across the Pacific, this might be America's only chance to stop Japanese expansion. One mistake, one misread code group, one incorrect assumption, and the war in the Pacific could be lost before summer ended. Deer's fingers moved across the IBM card sorter, searching for a pattern that might reveal the enemy's intentions. His colleague, Commander Joseph Rushfor, stood nearby in his characteristic bathrobe and slippers, having not left this underground bunker for days. The bathrobe wasn't eccentric behavior, though many would later characterize it that way. The basement was stifling, inadequately ventilated, and the heat from the IBM machines made proper uniforms unbearable. Rushfor's approach was purely practical. Results mattered more than military protocol in this cramped, sweaty workspace where the fate of nations was being decided by men hunched over code sheets and punch cards. Neither man knew that in the next week their work would change the course of World War II. The message intercepts were clear about one thing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was planning the largest operation since Pearl Harbor. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of supporting warships, and hundreds of the world's most experienced naval aviators were converging on a target designated by 2 letters in the Japanese code AF. The question that haunted every man in that basement dungeon was simple but devastating. What was AF? Where would the Japanese strike next, get it wrong, and America would lose the war in the Pacific before summer ended? The mathematics of potential disaster were brutally simple. Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers. America had 3 left in the Pacific, and one of those, Yorktown, was badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. If Nimitz positioned his carriers in the wrong place, if Station Hypo's analysis proved incorrect, the Japanese would achieve what Pearl Harbor had failed to accomplish: the complete destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier on a morning that would forever change both nations. December 7th, 1941, dawned bright and peaceful across the Hawaiian Islands. Families were preparing for church services. Sailors aboard the battleships Maraude at Pearl Harbor were eating breakfast or catching a few extra hours of sleep on what should have been a quiet Sunday morning. The Pacific Fleet sat at anchor, powerful but complacent, unaware that a catastrophe was minutes away. At 7:55 that morning, peace died. The Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack had been planned with meticulous precision by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who understood both Japan's temporary advantage and America's long-term industrial superiority. His goal was simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet before America could fully mobilize its vast resources. give Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then negotiate peace from a position of strength. Within 2 hours, the results were catastrophic. 8 battleships lay sunk or damaged. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that over 1,100 men died in seconds, entombed forever in their ship. A 1The-800 LB armor-piercing bomb had penetrated the forward magazine, triggering an explosion so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton warship out of the water. Men who witnessed it from other ships would never forget the sight of Arizona rising, breaking apart, and settling to the harbor bottom in less than 9 minutes. The USS Oklahoma rolled over after torpedo hits opened massive holes in her port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside her hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering on the hull audible to rescue workers who couldn't reach them in time. The USS West Virginia settled onto the harbor bottom with 106 crew members lost. Unlike Oklahoma and Arizona, West Virginia would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to service, fighting in major Pacific battles. Butin, December 7th, she was just another symbol of American vulnerability. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground, hangars and maintenance facilities demolished, 243 Americans dead with the casualty breakdown, revealing the comprehensive nature of the devastation. Navy 2008, Marine Corps 109, Army 218, and civilians 68. Another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, watched his command burn from the windows of his headquarters. As he stood there, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of that disaster. A spent bullet shattered the glass beside him. He reached down topic up the deformed projectile, examined it for a long moment, then said quietly to an aide standing nearby that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. Kimmel understood that his career was over, that he would bear responsibility for America's greatest military disaster. Within days, he would be relieved of command, replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial to clear his name would be denied. The blame for Pearl Harbor would follow him to his grave, but the attack, devastating as it was, had missed the most valuable targets. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that would prove providential. The Lexington was flying planes to Midway. The Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast, undergoing maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would win this war, though few yet understood that fundamental shift in naval power. The era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending. The era of carrier warfare was beginning, and America, through a combination of luck and Japanese miscalculation, still possessed its carriers. The Japanese had also ignored Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, massive installations holding millions of gallons of oil that kept the fleet operational. They bypassed the repair facilities, the dry docks, the submarine base, and the naval yard infrastructure. Japanese planners assumed these would be irrelevant after the fleet was destroyed. They were catastrophically wrong. These intact facilities would enable Pearl Harbor to serve as the staging base for America's Pacific counteroffensive. The submarines based there would devastate Japanese merchant shipping. The repair yards would resurrect damaged ships, including some the Japanese believed they had sunk. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into a hive of activity, supporting the war effort. In that basement dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited an impossible task. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, had been tracking Japanese communications for years, but with limited success. The unit's official designation was Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, but everyone called it Station Hypo, using the phonetic code for H, standing for Haya, Hawaii, where one of the radio intercept towers was located. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It was enough to provide some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations like the Pearl Harbor attack. The main Japanese operational code, which American cryptanalysts designated JN25, consisted of approximately 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit number groups in actual use, each representing a word or phrase. The system was ingenious in its complexity. Each five-digit group from the codebook represented a specific word, phrase, or concept. To make decryption even more difficult, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables. Essentially, they encrypted the messages twice. First, the message was encoded using the codebook. Then, random five-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. Thersalt was a message that appeared to be random numbers resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition. Breaking this system required stripping off the additive layer through mathematical analysis, then determining the meaning of each five-digit code group through painstaking analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. The crypt. Analysts had to identify which additive table had been used for each message, subtract those additives to reveal the original code groups, then figure out what each code group meant. And the Japanese changed both the code books and the additive tables regularly, forcing the crypt analysts to start over repeatedly. The additive system used books containing 300 pages, each page listing 100 random five-digit numbers. Tone crypt a message. The sender would start at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve the original code groups. For American crypt analysts, identifying which additive book and which starting point had been used was the first challenge. Sometimes they could determine this through radio call signs or message indicators. Other times they had to test hundreds of possibilities. On December 1st, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had changed to a new version of JN25, designated JN25B by American analysts. The new version used a different code book and new additive tables, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over from nothing. Every code group they had painstakingly identified became useless overnight. Every additive recovery technique they'd developed might no longer work. They were back at the beginning staring at streams of five-digit numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Rashford had known an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading the actual messages, had shown increased Japanese naval activity. Radio call signs were changing more frequently. Message volume was spiking. Ships were moving. Something big was happening. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. The 6 carriers and their escorts had transmitted nothing. You cannot track ships that emit no signals. The Pearl Harbor Task Force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands in November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific, where they were unlikely to encounter merchant ships or patrol aircraft. For 11 days, they maintained absolute communications discipline. Not a single radio transmission that could reveal their location or intentions. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history. Crypt analysts, traffic analysts, and intelligence officers had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the complete picture. Some warnings had reached Washington. Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted in a different system called Purple, had been partially decoded and showed increasing tension. But these diplomatic messages didn't contain military operational details. The attack came as a complete and devastating surprise. Rashford understood that dwelling on failure would guarantee more disasters. The only path forward was through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break, JN-25B could read enough Japanese messages to understand their plans. Perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could provide Admiral Nimitz with the one weapon that might offset Japan's current superiority foreknowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rashford had been an unlikely candidate for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, he'd enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When joining, he claimed his birth year as 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a falsification that would persist in his service records throughout his career. He was commissioned as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career suggested nothing special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks. But a fellow officer noticed something others had missed. Rashford had a talent for solving crossword puzzles. He was excellent at Auction Bridge, an advanced card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in complexity, that could make logical inferences from incomplete information. The officer recommended Rashford Navy's cryptanalysis program, ASMAL's specialized field that desperately needed talented recruits. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen people, working in cramped offices, barely funded, barely understood, trying to read the communications of potential adversaries. Rashapur proved to be a natural, but he possessed something beyond mathematical ability. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study from 1929 to 1932. During those years, Rashford lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. He understood Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication. This cultural knowledge combined with his cryptoanalytic training made him uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo when war came. His deputy and chief cryptologist was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary cryptologist who had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for code reading. Driscoll, known throughout the cryptolytic community as Miss Aggie, had been breaking codes since World War I. She had trained many of the Navy's best crypt analysts and had made crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes in the 1920s and 1930s. Her insight that IBM tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptanalysis had revolutionized the field. Dyer had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. He could look at a partially decoded message and intuit what the missing code groups might represent based on context and usage patterns from other messages. During the intense period leading up to Midway, Deer often worked extended shifts with the help of benzadrina tablets to maintain alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel working critical assignments that required staying awake for extended periods. I figured there were people out there getting shot at, Dyer later explained in oral history interviews. If it should happen that it turned out to inflict some injury on my health in the long run, so what? His colleagues joked that his desk sign was accurate when it read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The sign, visible to anyone entering the cryptanalysis section, captured the reality of the work. The cryptanalysis section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked in bathrobes and slippers when the heat became unbearable in the basement facility. The IBM machines generated tremendous heat, and the basement's inadequate ventilation made proper uniforms impractical during marathon work sessions. Formal military discipline evaporated in favor of results. Rank mattered less than analytical skill. Rashford fostered an environment where junior officers could question senior officers if the analysis demanded it, where credit for breakthroughs went to the team rather than individuals. As Rashford often said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context where hierarchy and credit for success were usually paramount. But Rashford understood that breaking JN25 required collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas, and the willingness to challenge assumptions regardless of who had made them. A junior enlisted radio man might notice a pattern that a senior officer had missed. A linguist might provide context that helped crypt analysts understand the meaning of a partially decoded message. Everyone's insights mattered. This collaborative culture would prove essential when the pressure reached its peak in the spring of 1942. The linguistics section was led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo, as part of the same exchange program that had trained Rashford. During the Midway period, Lowell was actually promoted to major on April 29, 1942. Though he continued to be referred to by his previous rank in many accounts, he worked with 5 other linguists who represented the Navy's best Japanese language specialists. Their job was to translate the portions of messages that the crypt analysts could decrypt, then work with intelligence analysts to determine what the messages meant in the larger context of Japanese naval operations. A partially decoded message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel might mean a training exercise or might mean an impending major operation. The linguists provided the cultural and linguistic context that helped distinguish between routine communications and critical intelligence. The traffic analysis section, led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckinson and John Williams, focused on message externals rather than content. They tracked which stations were communicating with each other, monitored the volume of traffic between units, analyzed priority designations, and mapped the patterns of communication that might reveal operational plans even when the messages themselves remained encrypted. Traffic analysis could provide warning of major operations days or weeks before. Crypt analysts could read enough messages to understand the details. An increase in message traffic between carrier divisions and supply units might indicate an impending sortie. Changes in radio call signs often preceded major operations. The sudden radio silence of a carrier division could mean they were underway for combat operations. This small team working in a windowless basement with inadequate equipment and overwhelming workload would soon Face the most important intelligence challenge in American history. The work was painfully slow and frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio men at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard. These messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the cryptanalysts had to strip off the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese used additive tables where they added another 5-digit number to each code group using non-carrying addition. This meant that if a code group was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the additive was 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, the encrypted result was 7, 9, 1, 3, 5, adding each digit separately without carrying to the next position. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could take hours for a single message. The cryptanalysts maintained massive files of recovered additives organized by date and radio circuit, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their additive tables. Once they had the original code groups, the real work began. The cryptanalysts maintained massive card catalogs representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages, building slowly towards certainty. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft or aviation gasoline or flight operations, 1. That appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel or supplies, or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups that appeared together frequently, building networks of meaning. But the actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and often brilliant guesses. The machines could sort and search, but only human analysts could interpret their results, make intuitive leaps, and recognize meaningful patterns in the chaos of partially decoded messages. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made sufficient progress against JN-25 that they could provide useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't come from a single dramatic moment, but from months of grinding work. Each recovered code group made subsequent messages slightly more readable. Each identified additive pattern made stripping the encryption slightly faster. Gradually, painfully, the opacity of Japanese communications began to yield. They had contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the U.S. Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, all combat conducted by aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against the experienced Japanese carrier forces, and it damaged 2 Japanese carriers, Shikaku and Tsuyaku, keeping them out of action for the next major operation. But the work remained frustratingly incomplete. Even at their best, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many messages remained completely opaque. The Japanese continued to change codebooks and additives, requiring constant adaptation, and the pressure was relentless. Every message might contain intelligence that could save American lives or prevent another disaster. Every hour spent on a message that yielded nothing was an hour that could have been spent on something more productive. The cryptanalysts worked with the knowledge that their success or failure would be measured in American casualties. Then in mid-May, they began intercepting messages about a massive operation. The traffic volume increased dramatically. Messages flew between the combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces, all pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was good, but they had to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each message, even if only partially readable, provided another piece of the puzzle. The target was designated AF in the Japanese location code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 km northwest of Hawaii that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. Midway consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. The atoll measured just over 2 miles across, but its location made it crucial. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. More importantly, a Japanese operation against Midway would force their remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto desperately wanted to destroy those carriers. He knew that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America. These once American shipyards began producing carriers in quantity. Japan needed to win the war in 1942 while they still held numerical and operational superiority. But in Washington, the Navy's main Krypton Analysis Center designated OP-20G disagreed with Station Hypo's assessment. OP-20G, located in the Navy Department building in Washington, was ostensibly the superior organization. They had more personnel, better equipment, and the advantage of being located at the seat of naval power. But they lacked Station Hypo's specialized focus on the Pacific theater and Rashford's team's cumulative experience with Japanese naval communications. The Washington analysts believed it might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Some thought it could be a renewed offensive in the south, Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Others feared an attack on Hawaii itself or even the American West Coast. Without certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. The disagreement intensified through late May. OP-20G had been recently reorganized. Lawrence Safford, a brilliant crypt analyst known as the father of Navy cryptology, had been replaced by Commander John Redmond, a communications officer with little cryptolytic experience. Redmond was competent in his previous field, but was, as one assessment noted, untrained in cryptanalysis. He brought a communications officer's perspective to an analytical organization, emphasizing proper procedures and chain of command over analytical insights. The bureaucratic battle between Station Hypo and OP-20 was about more than the location of the Japanese attack. It was about control of naval intelligence. Rashford reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his friend from their years together studying Japanese in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932. This direct communication worked brilliantly within the Pacific. Theater intelligence reached the commander who needed it without bureaucratic delays, but it infuriated the Washington command structure. Rashford was bypassing the established chain of command, providing intelligence directly to the fleet commander instead of routing it through official channels and OP-20G for validation. From Washington's perspective, this violated proper procedure and undermined central control of intelligence analysis. From Rashford's perspective, war didn't wait for bureaucracy, and Admiral Nimitz needed intelligence immediately, not after it had been reviewed, second-guessed, and delayed by multiple levels of command in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations who commanded the entire U.S. Navy, trusted his staff in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii. King was a brilliant but difficult man, known for his abrasive personality and his insistence on proper procedure. He disliked Rashford intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and overly confident. Commander John Redmond, who led OP-20G, resented Rashford's independence and insisted that all intelligence analysis should be centralized in Washington, where it could be properly controlled and coordinated. The disagreement wasn't just about bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. If Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. With only 3 carriers against Japan's carrier fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even once. The Pacific Fleet couldn't sustain another Pearl Harbor-level disaster. If those 3 carriers were sunk, nothing would stand between Japan and Hawaii except a few submarines and some land-based aircraft. The West Coast would be vulnerable. The entire American position in the Pacific would collapse. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. Actually, it was Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, one of Station Hypo staff members, who conceived the brilliant idea that would settle the question. Holmes was a submariner by training who had been assigned to intelligence work. He had the practical mindset of an operational officer combined with an analytical mind. He suggested that Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported that AF was short of water, Station Hypo would have definitive proof that AF meant Midway. It was a simple ruse, almost too simple to work, but simplicity was its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard a noon encrypted emergency message about water shortages at Midway, they would have no reason to suspect it was false. Water desalination equipment broke down regularly in tropical climates. A shortage would be a natural result of equipment failure. The Japanese intelligence services would report this useful tactical information about a potential target. Rashford immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's idea and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was the kind of commander willing to trust his intelligence officers and take calculated risks. He approved the plan immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method the Japanese couldn't intercept, to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could intercept. Around May 19th to 21st, 1942, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. The message sent in JN-25 and partially decrypted by Rashford's team stated that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. F meant Midway. The Japanese were coming, but Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G insisted the attack would come in mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or early June based on date indicators in the messages. The date time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN-25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken the date time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan, working under Dyer's supervision, discovered the method the Japanese used to encrypt their date time groups. It was a separate system layered on top of JN-25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. Edwin Layton, in his memoir, "And I Was There," specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method that the Japanese had used to lock up their date time groups. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypoto determined not just where the Japanese would strike, but when. On May 26th, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the date-time data using Finnegan's methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4th or 5th, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. The Washington analyst questioned whether Rashford was being too aggressive in his interpretations, reading certainty into partial messages, letting his confidence overcome analytical caution. Admiral King remained unconvinced. The career consequences for Rashford if he was wrong would be catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander for risking America's last carriers on a faulty analysis. His career would be over, and worse, American sailors would die because of this mistake. But Rashford stood by his analysis. His team had been working 18 to 24-hour shifts for weeks, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought to the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. The volume of message traffic, the units involved, the logistical preparations, the date indicators, and the Wateroo's confirmation all pointed to the same conclusion. Midway, early June, 4 carriers. This was Japan's next major operation. By May 27th, Rashford's team had decrypted enough messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most experienced carrier division in the world. They knew the force would include 2 battleships, among them Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. They knew about the 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers providing escort. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew about the invasion, force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land in Midway on June 7th. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route, the timing of the first airstrikes, and even the composition of the attack formations. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rashford and Leighton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The room was crowded with staff officers, many skeptical that such detailed intelligence could be accurate. Rashford, still in his bathrobe, walked them through the analysis, explaining how each conclusion had been reached, showing them the partially decrypted messages, demonstrating the analytical process that had yielded such specific information. No navy in history had ever possessed such complete intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before the battle began. It was a cryptanalytic achievement that would never be repeated at this scale. The combination of Station Hypo's breakthrough against JN-25, the volume of Japanese communications, and the Japanese assumption that their codes were secure, had created a perfect intelligence window. Nimitz now knew things that many Japanese officers didn't know. He understood Yamamoto's strategy better than some of Yamamoto's subordinates. But intelligence alone doesn't win battles. Nimitz faced a terrible calculus. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, but Yorktown was badly damaged. The carrier had been so severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that initial assessments estimated 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the West Coast. Structural damage to the flight deck, damage to the fuel system, fires that had killed dozens of crew members. Yorktown should have been out of action until late summer. Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days to make Yorktown battle-worthy. Not fully repaired, not restored to perfect condition, but functional enough to launch and recover aircraft to fight one more battle. The repair crews thought it was impossible. They were being asked to accomplish in 72 hours what would normally take 90 days. What followed was a near miracle of industrial effort. Yorktown entered dry dock number 1 at 11 a.m. on May 28th. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. Welders repaired structural damage to the flight deck. Electricians restored damaged systems. Damage control teams patched holes. Some repairs were temporary expedients that would require proper fixing later, but they would hold for one more battle. The ship was still carrying some repair crew when she steamed out the morning of May 30th, heading to join Enterprise and Hornet. Approximately 48 to 72 hours of actual repair work, compressed into 3 calendar days. A remarkable achievement that enabled Yorktown's crucial participation in the battle. Against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and experienced aviators, Nimitz could field 3 carriers with less experienced pilots. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. Their naval aviators had hundreds of hours of combat experience in China and across the Pacific. They had trained together for years developing sophisticated tactics. Their aircraft carriers had operated together as a strike force since the beginning of the war, achieving perfect coordination. American carrier doctrine was still evolving. Many American pilots had never seen combat. Some had only basic training in carrier operations. The disparity in experience was enormous. The numbers were daunting in every category. But Nimitz had the ultimate advantage that Rashford had given him: perfect intelligence. He positioned his carriers at a location they named Point Luck, 350 northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese carriers after the first strike on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident that they had achieved surprise, expected to attack the undefended island, recover their aircraft, rearm them with different weapons, and then hunt for American carriers they assumed were still at Pearl Harbor, or at least several days away from the battle area. Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed he would have hours to conduct operations before encountering any American opposition. He expected to bomb Midway into submission, then spend the afternoon searching for American ships, if any, were nearby. The possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway waiting in ambush never occurred to him.